Welcome to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. I'm your host, Molly Watts. If you want to change your drinking habits and create a peaceful relationship with alcohol, you're in the right place. This podcast explores the strategies I use to overcome a lifetime of family alcohol abuse, more than 30 years of anxiety and worry about my own drinking, and what felt like an unbreakable daily drinking habit. Becoming an alcohol minimalist means removing excess alcohol from your life so it doesn't remove you from life. It means being able to take alcohol or leave it without feeling deprived. It means to live peacefully, being able to enjoy a glass of wine without feeling guilty and without needing to finish the bottle. With science on our side, we'll shatter your past patterns and eliminate your excuses. Changing your relationship with alcohol is possible. I'm here to help you do it. Let's start now. Well, hello and welcome back to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast with me, your host, Molly Watts, coming to you from a little bit cloudy Oregon, but it's been doing this thing where it's cloudy in the morning and then burns off and it's beautiful in the afternoon and evening. Yesterday was just awesome in the afternoon and evening. So I think that's what it's going to do. And I'm good with that. If we start the rain pattern again, you all know I'm going to start whining. So hopefully that's not the case. So before we get into this week's show, first I have a prize winner of some alcohol minimalist swag. Remember that if you want to be entered into the drawing for the alcohol minimalist swag, all you got to do is leave a rating or review. A rating, if you leave a rating, you're going to have to send me a little note that says you did it because I don't know. I can only see the numbers. I can't see who left it. But if you leave a review, I'll be able to read it and see who left it. And this review comes from SJD0618. So if you are SJD0618, this was your review. I stumbled upon this podcast and it is just what I was looking for. I struggle with binge drinking, weekend warrior life of the party. The party girl. I've been this character so long, I have been convinced this is who I am. I don't want to or can't believe the story of no alcohol in my life. There are times I only have the single drink. Thank you for helping me to start to realize I can change my party girl story. And so appreciate SJD0618, your review. If you, SJD0618, want to send me an email, molly@mollywatts.com, and let me know who you are and where to send your alcohol minimalist swag, I will get that out in the mail to you. And so for anyone else, all you got to do, leave a review of the podcast or leave a review of the book, anywhere you listen to it, anywhere you find the book, and you will be entered to win as well. Today on the show, I am continuing the Alcohol and series, and this week's topic is important. I am talking with Beej Christie Karpen all about alcohol and trauma. Beej has been on the show before. I connected with Beej through Moderation Management. She is a life coach and an alternative therapist out of New York City, and recently added to her very long list of training and certifications with becoming an IFS practitioner. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. Beej is just wonderful. And I always love having conversations with her around alcohol and understanding our own feelings. She's just fantastic. And we wanted to get together and have this conversation because so many people who are turning to alcohol are victims of trauma. And so this is Alcohol and Trauma. And here's my conversation with Beej Christie Karpen. Hey, good morning, Beej. Thank you so much for being back here on the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. The last time you were here, I think it was still called Breaking the Bottle Legacy. So welcome back to the show. And I'm really, it sounds odd to say I'm excited about this conversation because it's a deep conversation. It's an important conversation, but I am really excited and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Molly. I'm excited to be back here too. And we picked a really nice light topic for today.
Right. For a Saturday morning, it's super light and easy, but no, it's not. But it's so important.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is important is to lighten it a little and
Hmm.
normalize it a little,
Yeah. Yeah.
because everyone carries some trauma in them.
Yeah. So we're talking about trauma. We're talking about this is another in my series of alcohol and conversation. So this is alcohol and trauma. And I
Hmm.
wanted to have this conversation because, as I shared with you before we got started, the statistics are pretty staggering. 70% of people who are being treated for substance use disorders report being victims or survivors of trauma. And so,
Hmm.
trauma, like we said, and so we want to get really into it first about defining exactly what trauma is, because there are, you as you share have shared with me, there are a lot of different versions of trauma, and it's important to understand that. And so talk to me a little bit about how we can even go about defining trauma.
Well, there's so many different types of trauma. Basically, really, I mean, there's single incident or capital T trauma people refer to, like an acute stress disorder where something happened, right?
Right.
Um, there's chronic trauma, like kind of pervasive trauma of growing up in a situation where you didn't feel part of things, or you had a caregiver who was, for whatever reason, not able to connect with you in a nurturing way. That's more like relational trauma, complex PTSD. That would be called developmental trauma. What goes on as you're developing, um, and so there's a lot of trauma that people carry around, that people walk around with, that they have no idea
Mm-hmm.
is, they wouldn't even define as trauma or know that it was trauma. Or, um, and if as if it weren't enough that we might have our own trauma, it also turns out that we can inherit trauma from our parents, our grandparents, and on up the line, right?
Yeah.
There's intergenerational trauma. There's a wonderful book called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin on that topic, family inherited trauma, racial trauma, a couple of books on that, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, The Inner Work of Racial Justice by Rhonda McGee. We have Holocaust trauma,
Yeah.
that many people carry from their ancestors, their relatives. And now we have pandemic trauma,
Yeah.
and
Right.
which will be giving and giving for many generations, I have no doubt. Um, and so I like to say to people, unless you skipped over childhood, you probably carry some kind of trauma with you, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe a lighter word would be stressors or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because trauma can carry out a big, heavy implication, and sometimes it really is, and sometimes it's stuff that you don't even realize is trauma or traumatic.
Right.
Or you just override it. No, that was when I was a kid, no big deal, and you don't realize how it's still in your system and still living with you.
Right. So I think there's, yeah, and so you kind of hit there right there, is there's different kinds of trauma, and I think people want to just put it into that box of, well, I never had a big incident, right? I never
Right.
had that something happened to me that I can point back to
Mhm.
and say that was traumatic, right? I mean, like if you don't have that,
Right.
then you sit there, you may wonder, well, is there trauma? Do I have trauma? Is there,
Right.
so I think one of the reasons I think you said to me, and I really loved this, is one of the ways that we can really check in with ourselves or really understand how important it is to uncover if there's trauma in our lives
Hmm.
is really how we're functioning in the world,
Yeah.
how we're feeling. And so talk to me about
Right.
that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the important thing to know about trauma is that it's not in the event. It's not, it's in how the nervous system responds to the trauma.
Hmm.
That was what I learned in day one of my 3-year somatic
Right.
experiencing trauma training. It is not in the event. It's a response in the nervous system. So different people respond to trauma in different ways. We see this in true crime all the time, right? Oh, I can tell he's the murderer because he didn't look upset.
Right.
you
Right.
know, and maybe that person's response to trauma is to go into a freeze state, right? Um, And this is why many different people can experience the same traumatic event and have very different responses to it. 9/11 is a great
Yeah.
example,
I was thinking about
right?
that. You're in New York City. So obviously that's a really
Hmm.
pertinent and powerful example because people had a wide range of responses to that.
That's right.
And so I think that's important too, because it's important to not judge what your response is, right? Not judge
Hmm.
if you're having a, a, a traumatic response, a bad response, a good response, whatever. It's just
Hmm.
being in tune and really understanding if you are not. I talk about this in my book about when people are turning to alcohol to try to buffer away stressors or things that so if we're separating the two, right? If you're really struggling with just basic living, like can't get out of bed, can't keep a
Hmm.
job,
Hmm.
can't do all that, there's probably some sort of trauma that is there that you are not, you're not in touch with.
Hmm. And even as something as simple as having a strong reaction to something, having
Mm-hmm.
a strong, if you find people, or a lot of times say, oh, you're overreacting.
Mm,
Um, it's probably because your system's responding to something that's not actually happening, something that's from the past that your body's
mm,
still holding.
mm-hmm. So, okay, so let's talk about that. Some of the common responses to trauma. So, yeah, so either whether or not we recognize trauma as the instigator, what are some common that this may be one of those things where if you are experiencing some of these things, you can look back and or you might need to do some discovery.
Yeah. I would say if you find yourself being, or people telling you you're overreacting, you're oversensitive, your emotions are very strong, or if you're a person who is just constantly in the kind of go, 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 keep going, never rest, it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
state. All of these are fight, flight, or freeze responses, right? To trauma. And
Mm-hmm.
other responses might include flocking, finding others who will justify your point of view. Oh my gosh, you're right. He's such a jerk. Never
Mm-hmm.
should have said that to you. That's a trauma response and not a bad one necessarily. Could
Right.
be a
Just a,
healthy
yeah.
one.
Right. Right.
Right. Fawning, dissociation, submitting can be a trauma
What's
response.
fawning?
Say your boss is being difficult and you're having kind of a reaction to it. Instead of maybe standing up to him and discussing it, you might, oh, you're right, okay,
Oh, I got you.
that could
Okay.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, that could be a response, or submitting, or like just giving in to whatever it is. Dissociation, where you're just kind of like, okay, I'm not here.
Right.
And again, this can sometimes be a good response, can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the chances are, that your nervous system is responding. I'll give you an example from my own life. I
Yeah.
noticed that every time I would go into a doctor's office, I would get really cranky and kind of mean. And this is, I tell my clients, is it like you or mean?
Yeah.
Um,
Not you.
can't picture that. Um, And when I kind of dropped into my body and asked, okay, what's going on here? What am I responding to that's not actually happening? And I remembered being in a very traumatic situation when I was 6 years old in a doctor's office,
Mm-hmm.
and where the agency was completely taken from me. My body was handled in a way where I didn't have control over it.
Mm.
My mom turned away. There was um, and that was what was getting activated in my system. Every time I walked
Okay.
into a doctor's office, I would feel like this lack of agency, this lack of control, this like, don't tell me what to, don't touch me, don't, kind of thing. And once I realized that, and I could kind of soothe that younger part of me, it's okay. It's not what's happening now. You're all
Right.
right. You know,
Right.
yeah,
I talk a lot about the fact that the past only exists in what I think about it today. So it's like that's kind of the same thing. It's like, okay, yes, but you have to be able to sometimes articulate and understand where it comes from
that's
first,
right.
right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
then you can soothe it. Then you can like, or, use that more present mind to be able to say,
Right.
okay, this isn't what's going on now. I am in control. I have this. So, but
Mm-hmm.
and that unconscious part of the brain, it's kind of important because that's a little bit about where addiction and trauma coincide, right? In that
Right.
lower nonverbal part of the brain.
Correct. It does not live in the reasoning part of the brain, not the
Right.
prefrontal cortex, the Mr. Spock logical part of the
Right.
brain. If it did, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
Right.
The
Right.
trauma and addiction live in the same part of the brain. They live in the limbic system, the amygdala, and now it turns out that with Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, you realize that there's a vagus nerve that connects the whole thing, the brain, all the way down to the digestive system,
Mm-hmm.
so that the body is very much involved in the trauma response and in the addiction response. And I see addiction as a response. Honestly, I see it as a response to trauma.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the absolute truth. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I love like the work of Dr. Adi Jaffe. Is like it's not we can't
Mhm.
abstinence, like focusing completely on the activity and trying to stop drinking isn't where we need to focus our attention. We need to focus our attention on what's causing the pain in the first place. That's why 70% of people who are being treated for substance use disorder are are reporting that they are victims of trauma. So it's
Mhm.
obvious that there's a high correlation between the two. I think
Mhm.
too, but that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation. It means there's a whole bunch of us, whether or not we ever develop a physical dependency on alcohol, there's a whole bunch of us that are turning to substances, alcohol, anything else to try to buffer away these traumatic experiences from whether they be from childhood or even, in our adult lives, right?
Absolutely. This part of the brain that we're talking about is really a very kind of simple part of the brain.
Right.
It's not that bright, right?
Right.
It's kind of like, okay, see alcohol, drink it, feel better, remember where you got it,
Right. Do it again.
trigger behavior reward, brief relief, right? Do it again. So, like addiction expert Judson Brewer wrote this book called The Craving Mind, and he
Yeah,
talks about this
Dr. Judd's been here before. He's been on the show.
love him, love him. I've studied with him. The reward center of the brain learns where to go to get more, right? And it thinks the more I get, the better I'm going to feel. So there's this trigger behavior reward thing that happens, and then, but then we add in the results.
Right.
I feel crappy. I hate myself, right?
Right.
Which leads directly back into the trigger, and
Right.
shame leads right back into the habit loop. And
Yeah.
whether we're shaming ourselves or someone else is shaming us. So when a family member or partner criticizes your drinking, it's unlikely that your prefrontal cortex is going to get activated. It's going to be this other part of the brain, right? It's
Right.
not going to be the prefrontal cortex that says, yes, okay, you're right,
Right.
I'm going to drink less. It's more likely the criticism will activate the emotional part of the brain and activate that shame cycle. So you go right back in. Oh my God, I got to drink. Now I feel shame. You don't know that's what's happening. It's not a lot of the time, but that is what's happening.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. I talk about all these parts of the brain all the time, the limbic
Hmm.
system, the
Hmm.
prefrontal cortex. I really think it's important for people to understand how their brains work in this sense, because it really helps you if you understand. I mean, just
Hmm.
even creating awareness of the fact that you have this limbic system that is activated all the time, in this from the our evolutionarily, it was set up to do this, right? It
That's
helped us
right.
survive.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so I personally found, for me, it was very important to, once I understood all of this, that it helped me
Hmm.
um to drop into the prefrontal cortex when my brain was sending out that message of, hey, this is a really good idea to keep drinking.
Hmm.
um my brain, I could go, oh, wait a minute, there's that prefront, there's that reward system just firing
Hmm.
again. It actually isn't
Hmm.
true. It's not a
Hmm.
really good idea to keep drinking.
Right. Right. And the ability to bring on that prefrontal cortex, I think, is harder for people who've suffered more and
Hmm.
certain types of trauma.
Yeah, 100%.
Um,
That's, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, a good way to develop that prefrontal cortex is meditation practice,
Hmm.
because that actually is scientifically proved through brain scans to uh, grow that part of the brain or activate. You see that people who, they've done these brain scans of people like never meditated and then 8 weeks later, 20 minutes a day meditation, and there's a lot more activity in the prefrontal cortex, a lot less activity in the amygdala. So
Which
you're
is,
actually
yeah.
able to be less reactive. Hmm.
fascinating and absolutely wonderful. And I love that you brought that up. I know that Judd Brewer talks about that a lot, about the meditation
Hmm.
part of it. And
Hmm.
you teach, by the way, folks, I'm going to link it in the show notes, but Beej has a free meditation class every Tuesday, right?
Yep.
Every Tuesday
Eight,
morning.
8:30 to 9 Eastern.
Yeah, 8:30 to 9 Eastern, and you can drop into that. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I know that for me personally, meditation is really hard, but it is a skill, and it is something that you can develop, and it's something that
Hmm.
you can learn. And just like she just said, it's scientifically proven, folks, to increase your brain's behaviors and prefrontal cortex. I mean, this isn't, and I love it because it's, it's available to you. It's not a drug. It's not, you get to do it with your own mind. And
Right,
that's
right.
just,
And this is something that meditators have known for thousands of years, but now science is getting on board and going, yeah, actually, you're right.
yeah,
It does. And now the Western world goes, oh, science proves it, okay. Even though if you do it, you'll know. You don't need any science telling you, because you
right.
suddenly notice that you're not as reactive, and you're able to kind of take those pauses and respond more skillfully when situations come up that are activating,
Well, it's,
upsetting.
yeah. And P.S. Because this is harkens back to my previous podcast, but it's also actually proven to extend longevity too. So there you
Hmm.
go,
Hmm.
folks.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And for those meditation averse people, there's a book called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. I forget the author.
Oh my gosh, I got to
Um,
find that.
yes, and there's actually a course weekend being offered at Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, this summer. I don't know the dates, but that might be something for people to attend. Because some people, especially if there's a high degree of trauma, they really have a hard time sitting with themselves at first,
Hmm.
especially. And the old-fashioned Buddhist way was like hit them on the head with something or whatever. Very, very old school, and Buddhists don't do that anymore, at least not in this country. But um, and now the thinking, there's a lot more trauma sensitive mindfulness being taught to meditation teachers and yoga teachers, so that people understand that it's not easy for everybody, and it's okay if you can't sit with yourself. It's just too much at first. And so you can learn other practices. And I talk about this sometimes in my meditation class. You can learn what we call informal practices that you
Hmm.
can do throughout the day rather than sitting if that's too much. Or you can do walking meditation very slowly,
Hmm.
just being aware of your feet. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about uh, the walk as though your feet are kissing the earth. I love that. So
Mm.
you're just paying attention to the feel of your feet on the floor, or the feel of your breath, if that's not too activating. For some people, it is. Um, and simple things like every time you wash your hands, which we do a lot of now. We've all learned how
Pandemic
important
trauma
hand
in
washing
play.
is.
Yeah, right.
Every time you wash your hands, you can take that as an opportunity to notice, where does the mind go
Mm.
when I'm not present with it, when I'm not present with this activity. It's the same thing on the meditation cushion. That's what you're teaching yourself, like, oh, my mind goes there, and you bring it back with friendliness. It's not like you're beating the crap out of yourself because you can't stay in this meditative state, right? So anyways, so a practice could be washing hands, noticing, oh, my mind's going into planning or plotting or worrying about what I have to do,
Mm.
or complaining, why'd you say that stupid thing last night, or whatever it is, it's going in these places. Instead, you can just say, okay, for right now, we're just going to be with this activity. You just tell the mind that it's okay, you can rest, we're just going to be here now. And you become very aware of, like, what does it feel like to wash your hands? And it's actually kind of a pleasant experience for most
Yeah.
people. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I love water. So like to
Mm,
me, I'm like, I mean, for me, water is my soothing noise. It's my soothing,
mm.
to
The
be,
sensual experience of it, yeah.
exactly. I
Hmm.
just like water, right? So
Hmm.
I can
Hmm.
imagine washing my hands being something that I can definitely practice with meditation. And I'm definitely one of those fidgety skeptics. So I have to get it. I mean, that's not, I mean, I want to, I know it, I understand it intellectually. It's just hard
Hmm.
for me. So,
Yeah.
um, well,
It's
let's
also
talk a little bit. Yeah.
easier in groups, I would say, too. If you can go to a live meditation class, or if you
Yeah.
can take a class online like mine. or
Mm-hmm.
something, and there are other people there doing it. And the tendency is, at first you're thinking like everyone else is sitting there becoming the Dalai Lama and I'm the only one with this crazy busy mind. But the fact of the matter is, everybody has a crazy busy mind. And one of my meditation teachers, David Nichtern, says if you sliced open the heads of all those meditators, it would look like a Bosch painting inside.
Right.
so,
Yeah.
so you don't know what's going on with other people, and you can assume that a lot of stuff is. And the practice is simply, it's a practice of returning. It's not a practice of staying in some constructed state. It's a practice of noticing with gentleness. Oh, where does my mind go when it's not here? Oh, okay. There it went. Isn't that kind of funny? Maybe you see a little humor in where your mind goes, and then you bring it back. Just say, oh, for right now, let's just see if we can stay here for 1 or 2 breaths before it
Nice.
wanders off again. It's like training a
Nice.
puppy.
Right.
Yeah,
I love that, training a puppy.
it is. Puppy wanders off. You don't beat up the puppy. Oh, okay, come on back here, and maybe it stays a little bit longer the next time. I used to
So,
teach a lot of classes in corporations, and they actually had dogs wandering in and out of the meditation room sometimes.
oh, well, there
It's
you
funny.
go. Oh,
Yeah, and so I would use them as, okay, come here. And sure enough, the puppy would turn around and face the class in perfect puppy meditator pose and be all calm. And then a second later, would go off and get interested in something else. So that's just like the mind. So you just bring it back with that same kind of humor and gentleness.
I love that. Hey everyone, just a quick break in the show to talk with you about Sunnyside. Now, you've heard me talk about Sunnyside on the show before. I've had Nick and Ian, the founders, here as my guests. I am just so impressed with them. They are deeply mission driven. They are building a service to help millions of people create a healthier relationship with alcohol with no pressure to quit or feel guilty. So they are very aligned with everything I talk about here at Alcohol Minimalist. I wanted to share with you some thoughts and comments made by people in my group and my clients who use Sunnyside. I checked it out and was pleasantly surprised. I have used a few tracking apps and despised them. But the support, the daily check-ins, and the plan, yes, the plan. I signed up for 3 months yesterday and actually looked forward to the check-in today. I have no doubt this tool is a step forward for me. I just want to thank you to everyone who recommended Sunnyside in this group and all of your advice throughout. I'm having the best start to a week of moderating since I fell off the wagon in January. You work the plan and it works. Thank you, everyone. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take their word for it. I want you to check it out for yourself. Go to www.sunnyside.co/minimalist to get started on a free trial today. So, talk about how people can kind of explore their own relation between trauma and some of the things that they might be using to buffer away those traumas. I don't want to say addiction, because we don't typically talk about, we can talk about addictive behavior because drinking obviously is an addictive behavior, but my general, this
Yeah.
podcast is dedicated to those people who are using alcohol, maybe in a habited way. Or I know for myself personally that I definitely developed a habit of over drinking because I was not because I was just like, yes, in my early days, I used alcohol just, as a party thing. But then over time,
Mm-hmm.
it became something where I was using it on a daily basis to try to buffer away the stress of life. I
Yeah.
wouldn't go back for me, I wouldn't say there was trauma, at least in that big T sense of a word, but
Mm-hmm.
definitely trying to buffer away. And I think there's things, beyond alcohol, people tend to turn to,
Yeah.
food.
Sex, drugs, gambling, technology, social media, gaming, etc. Um,
Lots. Yeah.
yeah. So what do they all these things have in common is they take you away from where you are, right?
Right.
They put you
Yeah.
into some other state. So a way to explore this for yourself, or people who are listening, I don't mean you, Molly,
Yeah. No,
but
I think,
I know
hey,
you've
Beej,
explored a lot.
hey, I'll take all the therapy online you can give me right here. You just do it.
So an exploration might be thinking like what took you away from where you were as a child?
Mm-hmm.
When things felt stressful, what soothed you?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was chocolate chip cookies, maybe it was gaming, maybe it was something else that kept you out of the house or kept you out of the situation you were in. And not necessarily bad things. Maybe you got really interested in something like sports or music. So it's good
Mm-hmm.
to just kind of explore, what did I do with gentle curiosity? Where did I go? And then maybe, and you were mentioning, I mean, there are different types of drinkers too, right? I mean, uh, some people tend to go more toward the social drinking, as you were saying
Right.
when you were younger, or more of an alone drinker, or we have crossover artists who do both, right?
Right.
Um,
I would tell I love
so
crossover artists. That's like, I guess
yeah,
that's what it is.
so with social drinking, and I work a lot with parts work with IFS, which we talk a little bit about if you want, but
Yeah.
um, I often will hear someone say like, I feel like a part of me still thinks I'm 18. This will
Mm-hmm.
be like a 50-year-old saying that.
Right.
Um, and so sometimes parts of ourselves do get stuck in the past,
Mm-hmm.
and a time when we felt like we needed that for survival. So then you might ask yourself, okay, well, what was going on when I was in college or whatever? Uh, that partying part of you might have developed more strongly, and maybe that part showed up at a time when you were feeling lack of connection or isolated, and you really wanted to feel accepted by people,
Mm-hmm.
and then it became habitual. So
Right.
that might be a pattern of a social drinker. I'm not saying it is, but it's just like
Right.
that's how you would do the exploration. And with the alone drinking, it might be a depressed or lonely part, isolated part that you're trying to soothe or numb. And then when you go back to like, well, how did I try to soothe myself when I was 8 or when I was little, and you kind of ask yourself, it's amazing how much wisdom we have when we stop to listen. It might have been when you were 8 and your mom wasn't present for, couldn't be with you or wasn't able to, either for emotional reasons or work or whatever it was, wasn't nurturing when you needed her. So maybe you found solace in taking a bag of chocolate chip cookies to the treehouse or something. Or maybe you found solace in video games. I like to tease people that video games are a gateway drug.
Say.
um, it's always interesting to look at what's underneath the behavior. Like, when did something in you start seeking ways to change how you were feeling,
Mm-hmm.
ways to take you out of however you were feeling into feeling some other way.
Yeah. That is super powerful because I think that's, one of the things I talk about all the time is about the fact that it's that feeling, right? Where we typically are using something to change how we see it as a way to
Yeah,
change how we're feeling. I mean, that's
exactly.
really the
Hmm.
the driver, right?
Hmm.
It's not there's no other reason for us to take whatever it is that we're turning to. We're doing it in an attempt to change how we are feeling. And
Exactly. And yeah, and that's another thing that the meditation and mindfulness practice teaches us is to stay. Remember that puppy?
right? Yeah,
Stay.
stay. And
It's okay to stay with what you're feeling. It's okay to sit and see if you can tolerate it. See if you can tolerate it a little bit more than you might think.
yeah.
It doesn't mean that if it starts to really overwhelm you, then no. But just out of curiosity, do some experiments. Can I
Yeah.
sit with this a little bit longer than I thought?
Yeah. I talk about allowing the feeling, just allowing it to be there.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to try to change, it's okay. I mean, and I think that's also
Mm-hmm.
really important. I talk a lot about life's 50-50. There's good and bad. We have to allow the bad to be there. We can't just want to not feel any any negative emotion in this world. That's just not realistic. Now, when
Absolutely.
things become, overwhelming, then we're talking about a different issue.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
in a day-to-day world, in our lives, we are all going to experience good, bad, sad, mad. We want to experience it all, right? I mean, that is
Right.
the full human experience when we're able
Mm-hmm.
to express and allow all of our emotions to be there. And
Yeah.
and I really try to encourage people that you are capable of handling any most emotions. Now, I wouldn't say that again. I don't someone who's experienced significant trauma or has that big capital T and acute trauma, or something that's pervasive. I I wouldn't feel comfortable in saying, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That requires extra work, and that may require therapy, and that may require
Mm-hmm.
some additional tools. Um,
Definitely.
so I know in our you asked, thankfully, in both a couple of different my group and in the moderation management group for some people if they had some questions about this.
Hmm.
And one of the questions was, does chronic stress have the same impact as acute trauma in addiction? So what do you
Hmm.
want to say about that?
Well, I think acute trauma is defined as single incident trauma. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure if that's what they were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but chronic stress, I would put in the same category as pervasive trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So you can call it stress, you can call it trauma. It'd be easier to call it stress, perhaps. Maybe you're in a work situation or home situation where you're constantly in a state of hyperarousal or hypervigilance because it doesn't feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we're not necessarily talking about physical safety, but also emotional or psychological safety. And that can definitely have as strong an impact as acute or single incident trauma.
Mm-hmm. And so basically, yeah, what I think what we've both said all along the way here is that there's, statistically, it's proven that trauma leads, whether it's, I mean, a single incident trauma or pervasive trauma, there's a high correlation between the two and addiction. I mean, that's just the way it is,
Hmm.
70%,
Hmm. Hmm.
according to statistics. And so for anyone, even, so that just means that anyone that's starting to see an uptick, or if you've noticed and maybe the pandemic, this is a really good tie-in to pandemic, because the pandemic drinking has been on the increase, right? So
Hmm.
if you're
Hmm.
seeing an uptick in your own behavior and an uptick in your own drinking, you might want to look and see what if there is some sort of impact that might be happening, some kind of chronic stress that's happening.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic really pointed to how people's trauma responses are in their
Right.
how their nervous systems respond to trauma. So like, yes, you could say that right now we're in one big collective trauma, right? We're
Right. Yeah.
all in the trauma vortex together, but we don't all respond the same way. And we love to criticize other people for responding different ways, right? But our nervous systems respond very differently, and this often reflects, as you're saying, old patterns of how our nervous systems respond to trauma. So if you think about how you responded, and again, not you, Molly, only,
Yeah.
but how how we respond to trauma, how you responded to trauma in your past, you might notice that it follows a pattern. How you've responded to other traumatic events in your life, how you responded to the feeling of unsafety or uncertainty as a child. And some people become very insular,
Mm-hmm.
and there might be an old response from when they were kids and felt danger. Would they kind of curl up and hide somewhere? Other people went into survival mode. I put myself in that category. Oh, all my income went away. Okay, let's see, what can I do? And I created the conscious drinking workshops online
Mm-hmm.
to not just create income for myself, but to help all the people who were struggling, who also couldn't afford therapy at that point because, they had lost their jobs. But all the people that were struggling with over drinking, by teaching the mindfulness techniques and tools that have helped my clients. So my go-to response to trauma is survive and help. And when I think about how did I respond to trauma as a child, it was fight, survive. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
some people went into denial. Maybe when their systems became overwhelmed as kids, their go-to response was to pretend it's not happening, just to dissociate from it, right? And others became paranoid, believing it was a conspiracy. And maybe the pandemic made them feel unsafe enough to resort to an old pattern or belief from childhood. Maybe as children, they were perpetually gaslighted by a caregiver, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
many different responses.
Right. And I love that you said that. And I really do think that, yes, we don't want to shame people for whatever response they're having, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
there's
Yeah.
I talked about this before on an episode about this whole trigger warning. There's actually been study on the whole. I think the reason that I always am trying to be careful about the big T versus littler, whatever chronic stress, is because I don't ever want to offend somebody who has had one of those truly single incident
Mm-hmm.
traumas where it's
Yeah.
very, I would never want to, I, I feel like I don't ever want to invalidate something really truly horrible that happened to someone with what
Mm-hmm.
I would call my very minor trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I just don't, I think that's why there's a tendency for people to want to gradiate trauma so that we don't, at
Hmm.
least from my perspective, I don't
Yeah.
ever want to, to intermix or to take away from somebody's really terrible, horrible incidents in their lives
Yeah.
that and try to liken them to even the chronic stress that I sometimes feel from.
Hmm.
But I guess it's
Hmm.
not. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't know that that's what I'm hearing you tell me is it's really more about what the body's experiencing, and if somebody has chronic stress, a pervasive it really especially there could be a lot of things that have happened due to the pandemic to people, right? Or
Hmm.
that could cause a response for them. I don't know exactly what I'm saying there. I kind of went off
Yeah.
topic, but you know what I mean,
Post-traumatic stress response for sure. Yeah. And I think what you're saying, from what I understand, and I agree with you. Don't want to take away or
minimize, I guess. Yeah.
minimize. Thank you. Someone who's had a very serious single incident event or serious multiple incident events. Um, and at the same time, it's important to recognize that, as we said at the beginning of the call, that trauma is not in the event as much as it's in the nervous system's response
Right.
to the event. So I think there was another question on that Facebook page that was kind of about that. The one about the auto accident.
Yeah, there was
Uh,
the question was, I know some young people whose mother died in an automobile accident in which they were also passengers. I wonder what can be done to help them stay off the path of addiction as they enter their teens and beyond. Um, the husband takes the kids to movies, games, and out to eat. They haven't received professional help though. So that was the
yeah,
question. Yeah.
that was the question. Yeah, and I think I responded. First of all, so sorry
Yeah,
to read
obviously.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, just no words.
right.
Um, and as far as the question of how to, keep help them stay off the path of addiction, I would say that even though most addiction is rooted in pain and trauma, not all trauma leads to addiction, interestingly enough.
Right.
So a lot of it depends on how their nervous systems processed the traumatic event, and how their nervous systems are, it's kind of nature nurture kind of thing, how their nervous systems are set up in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And people respond very differently to the same traumatic event based on their nervous systems and their own conditioning and experience, their past trauma, etc. And a lot depends on how quickly they get support and what type.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if they have access to a good trauma therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And also, often the addictive patterns are formed early in life. So if their habitual response to stress or trauma is to soothe with food, for example, they might be more likely to turn to alcohol or drugs later to soothe similar pain or
Right.
post-traumatic stress when it arises. Um, and again, just the sooner they receive some kind of support, the better, to help them navigate this. Because if people feel seen and supported, even after any kind of traumatic event, the chances of recovering without a lot of post-traumatic stress are much higher.
Mm-hmm.
And thank goodness for this person's husband, the person who wrote
Yeah.
the
Right.
email. They're just friends, I think, taking them to movies, games, and things that she said, because the more love and connection they feel, the more likely they are to recover more quickly,
Mm-hmm.
the more
Yeah.
support they have.
So I think that that's a really, I want to make sure that we touch upon this. And the last question we're going to touch on is, how do we know if our drinking is related to trauma or if it's just an unhealthy habit that we picked up? But one of the things I want to really make clear to people as we answer this question is, no matter what it is, whether you have trauma or whether it's just an unhealthy habit, there's hope for you.
Hmm.
There's hope
Hmm.
to not only change your drinking habits, but there is hope if you have trauma that you can survive and that that you can resolve. You can become, someone who feels their emotions and enjoys life. And there are tools, there are therapists like Beej, there are people that are there. And the just because once you figure it out, even if you figure out that, yes, I have some trauma that I need to deal with, you can and you can do that anytime. You can take
Yeah.
action and you can really change your life. So um the question specifically was, how do we know if our drinking is related to trauma or just an unhealthy habit that we picked up?
Yeah. And that it does sometimes take a lot of exploration, but I'd say that it can depend on how chronic the addiction has become.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just a habit that you picked up in college and you weren't particularly attached to it, you might find that it's pretty easy to drop. The majority of people who are problem drinkers, believe it or not, if we define that as habitually drinking more than the NIAAA guidelines for healthy drinking,
Right.
the majority of those people recover with no intervention at all.
Mm.
When you think about college drinking, most people just age out of it. They get serious about their careers, they start a family, whatever, they get focused elsewhere, right? Alcohol doesn't really fit in the same way, or at least not over drinking.
Mm-hmm.
The ones for whom the habit lingers and it becomes more chronic and difficult to break, I would say that there's more likely a larger degree of trauma underneath and an underability for the person's nervous system to process that trauma without help. Not
Mm-hmm.
meaning they can't do it, but as you said, you can
Right.
do it with help. You can learn how to regulate your own nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So when I work with problem drinkers, I find it's most effective to parse out the habit from the trauma response and work with each separately, right? So the
Yeah.
habit stuff, you learn a lot of that, and you can go to moderation management, go to moderation.org, go to their meetings. You'll hear a lot about how people work with their habits.
Mm-hmm.
No pre-gaming, delay,
Right.
eat food first, drink other stuff in between. There's a million of these tools you can use. So what I find is effective is working with the internal and the external tools. So the external tools, great. And but also working with, getting to know your system, your nervous system. How can you learn to self-regulate it? It's a lot of what we've been already discussing in this call.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think it's important to understand why we first started drinking, or is it just this was a question from the group, and I actually
Mm-hmm.
really liked this. Is it important to
Mm-hmm.
understand why we first started drinking, or is it more important to just start cutting back?
Yeah, and first I want to say I'm so thankful for the people that wrote in these questions because they're really good ones, and I'm sure
Yeah,
they're not the only ones that are
right,
wondering
exactly.
these things.
Yeah.
So, so the reason it might be helpful to understand is because it's easier to heal something when you know what it is you're healing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you discovered that you started drinking to fit in, for example, as we talked about earlier, you might ask yourself, well, what was important about that? Yes, we all probably wanted to fit in middle school and high school, and we all felt like we didn't, no matter what.
Right.
But if you ask yourself, what was important to me about fitting in? What was underneath that desire? You might find that underneath that, there might have been a feeling of isolation or loneliness, or I'm somehow less than. And that's, in my opinion, that's sort of where the trauma is. Um, so if you're able to get in touch with that younger part of you, then you can offer healing to your younger self.
Mm-hmm.
What can you offer that child, and kind of go back, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and see if you can get in touch with that younger part of you as your wise adult self, and ask the child, what do you need? What did you need?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the answer comes back. The child needed to be heard or listened to. Maybe they needed a hug. Maybe they needed to just be taken out of the situation. One of my clients, I did this with him, and he's like, he wants to go outside and play ball. Like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
take him outside and play ball.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they needed to sprout wings and fly away. Doesn't matter if it even makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you can have a reparative experience then
Mm-hmm.
with this younger part of you that's still, like, let's face it, we are ourselves at every age.
Mm-hmm.
It's all still in there. And then we can heal it. As
Mm-hmm.
your wise adult self, you can go back and give the child the experience they needed. Bring the child into the present with you and let them know they're okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't do that inner investigation, you might find you're more likely to be having to white knuckle it quite a bit because you're just working
Right.
with the external tools. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I talk about, obviously, I talk about that all the time. I talk about it's our thoughts that lead to our feelings and then the actions. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we just focus on the actions, which is basically what you're saying, if we focus on the tool and we never back up to the feelings and to the
Yeah.
thoughts that are causing the feelings, we cannot
Mm-hmm.
actually change the habit. We can't change what's going on. We can't change our, our reason for drinking. Right. So we have to
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
we have to understand it all if we really want to have, in my opinion, and I think in yours too, if you want to have
Mm-hmm.
true sustainable change, if you want to really, I talk about being an alcohol minimalist, and my episode last week was on creating that peaceful relationship and what peaceful means.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you don't
Yeah.
get to a peaceful relationship unless you're willing to do this type of inner work.
Yeah. And ways to get to that peaceful, maybe we could do another podcast on this and we talk about how we heal all of the parts, because this is important that people have these parts of themselves that they're at war with all the time. And that creates a lot of not peace, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so when they can start to, um, and this is where the IFS work comes in so handy, um, is getting to know each part individually and healing it. And, as goofy as it sounds, Frank Anderson, who's one of the leading psychiatrists who works with IFS, will say, trauma blocks, love heals.
Yeah. Right.
So if you can love every part of yourself, no matter how much you don't love it, and find a way through deep work to create, and that's how you create a peaceful experience within yourself, is to get to know all your parts and get to send, be able to send them love or see the humorous side of them.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear my inner critic, I'm like, oh, hi, isn't that funny? Yeah, welcome. That's really kind
Yeah.
of funny, that
Thank
that
you for your,
comment. And
yeah, exactly.
thanks.
Thank you for your observations.
Thanks for your feedback. Right. So I have a friendlier relationship with my critical parts than I ever did before, and that helps tremendously.
Oh, we are definitely doing another episode, Beej, because these are like one of people love them, and I love talking to you, and I cannot wait to learn more about IFS. Folks, tell us really quickly because we'll do another episode on this, but what it is. You just got recently certified this year in a new. She's got a laundry list of credentials, folks. So if you want to check it out, her links on the website, but I mean I'll link it in the show notes. But tell us about this most recent certification.
Well, IFS stands for Internal Family Systems, and it's really, it has nothing to do with actual external families. It has to do with the parts that live inside ourselves and act as have certain roles, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have the kind of wounded parts, which they call exiles, the child parts, and then we have the self, which feels great, fine. Self is fine. And then we have the protector parts. So the protector parts usually fall into two categories, and one is proactive, the manager parts, who kind of manage our lives and keep everything okay. We're feeling okay, feeling safe, going to do this. And then there's what they call the firefighters, which are the reactive parts,
Mm-hmm.
which show up when a situation doesn't feel safe or
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel okay. So to tie this into problem drinking, you might say the manager shows up to say, okay, have a drink before the event. It'll calm your system, and then you can proceed and go into the event. The firefighter would be the one that you're in the event, you see someone that for what, an ex or something, you're like, oh my God, I need a drink. Ah! And the firefighter says, okay, here's how to, I know how to fix this. And soothe, right? So I mean, it's kind of a funny way to look at it, but these are basically the main categories, right?
Mm-hmm.
The parts of us that manage our lives and the parts of us that react to stuff.
So
It's a
it's
simple way
another
of looking at it, but
a
it's
framework.
a very deep, complex process of learning it. But you can learn it on all levels, really. There's a book that's super simple. It's like looks like a child's book. It's called We All Have Parts. and, uh, an illustrated guide to healing trauma with internal family systems. So that if people are interested,
Yeah, we'll put that.
taking a
We'll
look
link
at that.
that. We'll link that in the show notes too. But yes, let's do another IFS podcast because I'm sure I'm deeply interested, and I know if I'm interested, other people are. So we'll fire it up again, folks. So
Great.
another episode with Beej Christie Karpen, and on that note, though, this one has gone on and we are long because we can never stop. We can't just,
I know.
it's just, we start talking. And like I said, you and I could probably talk for hours and we'd be like, oh, yeah. And yeah. And then it'd be like,
No kidding. I have no doubt.
shoot. Oh, wow. That was 2 hours. That might be a long podcast. um,
Exactly.
have a very happy 4th of July. We're recording this right at the beginning of July, and
Yeah.
it'll come out just after that. But I appreciate you taking the time, Beej, and everyone go check it out. All the links will be in the show notes to learn more about, and especially if you are someone who feels like trauma is really needing to be addressed in their lives, I highly recommend talking with Beej and figuring out another one of her offerings that might be helpful for you.
Thank you, Molly. It's just wonderful to talk with you again, and have a, as my dad would have said, have a glorious fourth.
Thank you. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you for listening to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to helping you change your drinking habits and to create a peaceful relationship with alcohol. Use something you learned in today's episode and apply it to your life this week. Transformation is possible. You have the power to change your relationship with alcohol now. For more information, please visit me at www.mollywatts.com.